Atlantis is usually treated as a question. Did it exist or didn't it? But within the systems described in the secret teachings of all ages, that question is not the point, because Atlantis is not presented as something to be proven. It is presented as something to be understood, not as a location, but as a structure, a model of civilization where knowledge, symbol, and power were not separated into different systems, but operated as one. And this is what makes it significant, because if you look at the progression we've already moved through, the mysteries, initiation, the schools, the initiates, the temple, symbolic language, each of those elements has been explored as a separate component. Atlantis represents the point where those components are unified, not fragmented, not distributed, but functioning together as a single system. And this is why it continues to appear across different traditions, under different names, in different forms, because it is not describing a place alone, it is describing a state, a level of coherence where structure is not hidden, it is embedded into everything. Which means the real question is not whether Atlantis existed in the way it is described, but what kind of system it represents, and more importantly, what happens when that system is no longer intact. If the earlier stages of this series explored how knowledge is structured, then Atlantis represents what that structure looks like when it is fully integrated. Because within the systems described in the secret teachings of all ages, Atlantis is not positioned as a beginning in the sense of something primitive. It is positioned as a peak, a point where symbolic language, initiation, environment and knowledge are no longer separate systems that need to be learned individually, but aspects of a unified whole. This is a crucial shift, because everything we have explored so far has required progression, step by step, layer by layer. But Atlantis is described as a state where that progression has already taken place, where the structure has stabilized, where the system is no longer being assembled, but is already functioning. And when a system reaches that point, something changes. It becomes self-reinforcing. Knowledge is no longer something that needs to be preserved externally, because it is embedded into the way the civilization itself operates, into its architecture, its symbols, its systems of communication, its structures of power. Everything reflects the same underlying pattern. This is what gives Atlantis its weight within the mystery traditions. Not as a lost city, but as a reference point, a model of coherence. But before we move deeper into how that coherence is described and what specific elements define it, take a moment to ground yourself in the progression of this series. If you're starting to see how each part connects, how the structure builds from one episode to the next, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because this is not a collection of isolated ideas. It is a system unfolding, and the further you move into it, the more that system begins to reveal itself. So the question becomes, if Atlantis represents a fully integrated system, what exactly holds that system together? To understand what holds a system like Atlantis together, you have to look beyond the idea of civilization as something built from physical structures alone. Because within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, the foundation of Atlantis is not material, it is structural, not in the sense of buildings, but in the sense of relationships, the relationship between knowledge and environment, between symbol and meaning, between perception and reality. In earlier stages, these relationships had to be taught. They had to be introduced through initiation, reinforced through structure, and maintained through discipline. But within Atlantis, those same relationships are described as inherent. They do not need to be explained because they are already embedded into the system. This is what creates coherence, not the presence of advanced knowledge, but the alignment, of that knowledge with every other aspect of the civilization. Nothing exists in isolation. Every element reflects the same underlying structure, and when that alignment is in place, something changes in how knowledge functions. It is no longer something that needs to be protected. It becomes self-sustaining, because it is not stored in one place. It is distributed across everything. This is why the descriptions of Atlantis often emphasize harmony, not as an aesthetic quality, but as a structural condition, a state where the relationships between elements are stable enough to maintain themselves without constant correction. But this stability does not come from simplicity. It comes from precision, because for a system to remain coherent at that level, every component has to align. Every symbol, every structure, every method of transmission. And this is where Atlantis differs from the systems that follow it, because once that level of precision begins to weaken, the system can no longer maintain itself. The relationships begin to loosen, the alignment begins to shift, and when that happens, the coherence that once held everything together starts to fragment. But before that fragmentation begins, there is a moment where the system is still intact, still functioning, still capable of sustaining itself without external correction. And that moment is what Atlantis represents, not the beginning of civilization, but the point where civilization reaches structural unity, where knowledge is not separate from life, it is embedded within it. And once you see it this way, the idea of Atlantis shifts. It is no longer something distant. It becomes a reference point for what a fully integrated system looks like, and that raises the next question. If coherence is what defines Atlantis, what causes it to break? If Atlantis represents a state of coherence, then the next layer of understanding lies in how that coherence is maintained. Because alignment, once achieved, does not sustain itself automatically. It requires balance. Not balance in the sense of stability alone, but balance between forces that are constantly interacting. Within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, these forces are often expressed symbolically. Light and darkness, order and chaos, expansion and contraction. These are not opposites in conflict, they are complementary. Each one defines the other, and within a coherent system, they exist in relationship rather than opposition. This is what allows the system to remain dynamic without becoming unstable, because a system that is entirely fixed cannot adapt, and a system that is entirely fluid cannot hold structure. Coherence exists between these two conditions. It allows for movement, but within a framework that prevents collapse. In Atlantis, this balance is described as being maintained across all levels, not just within individuals, but within the civilization as a whole. The structures of knowledge reflect the same balance as the structures of power. The symbolic systems reflect the same balance as the physical environment. Everything operates according to the same underlying pattern. This is what creates continuity, because when every part of a system reflects the same relationships, those relationships reinforce each other. They stabilize the system without requiring constant intervention. But this also reveals something important, because if coherence depends on balance, then imbalance becomes the point of failure, not immediately, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual shift, a deviation in the relationships that hold the system together. At first, this shift may be subtle, almost unnoticeable. The system continues to function, the structures remain in place, but the alignment begins to weaken, and once that weakening begins, the system has to compensate. It has to correct itself. But if the deviation continues, those corrections become less effective. The balance becomes harder to maintain. And over time, the coherence that once defined the system begins to break down. This is not described as an external event. It is internal, a change in the relationships that sustain the system. And this is what leads into the idea of collapse, not as a sudden destruction, but as the result of a process, a gradual movement away from alignment, which means the fall of Atlantis is not separate from its structure, it is the consequence of it. And that is what makes it significant, because it shows that even a fully integrated system contains the conditions for its own breakdown, and once that process begins, it cannot be reversed in the same form. When you step back from the description of Atlantis as a civilization, what becomes clear is that its function is not historical in the way it is often treated. It is structural, because what is being described is not simply a place that existed and was lost. It is a model, a way of illustrating what happens when every layer of a system aligns. Knowledge, environment, symbol, power, perception, all operating according to the same underlying pattern. And when that alignment is in place, the system appears complete, self-sustaining, coherent. But this is also what makes it fragile, not in an obvious way, but in a structural one, because when every part of a system depends on that alignment, even a small deviation can begin to affect everything else. The system does not break immediately. It adjusts, it compensates, it attempts to maintain its balance. But if the deviation continues, those adjustments begin to accumulate, and over time the coherence that once held the system together starts to dissolve. This is where Atlantis shifts from being a description of unity to a reference point for fragmentation. Not because it disappears entirely, but because its structure can no longer be maintained in the same form. And once that happens, the system has to change. It has to redistribute, it has to find new ways of preserving what can no longer be held in a single unified structure. This is where symbols, myths, and separate traditions begin to emerge, not as inventions but as fragments, pieces of a system that was once whole, now existing independently. And this is why Atlantis continues to appear across different cultures, because what is being remembered is not the place itself, but the structure it represents, a memory of coherence, a reference to something that once operated as a unified system. And once you see it this way, Atlantis becomes less about the past and more about the pattern, a pattern that can be recognized whenever systems move toward alignment and whenever they begin to move away from it, which means the real significance of Atlantis is not in its existence. It is in what it reveals about how systems function, how they stabilize, how they fragment, and how the transition between those two states begins. And that transition is where the next stage begins, because once coherence is lost, what remains has to be preserved in a different way. If Atlantis represents a system in perfect alignment, then its significance does not end with its existence. It extends into what follows, because a system that is fully integrated does not simply disappear without consequence. It leaves traces, not always in a complete form, but in fragments, in symbols, in patterns that persist even when the original structure can no longer be maintained. This is where the idea of Atlantis begins to shift. It is no longer just a model of coherence. It becomes the point of transition, the moment where unity begins to give way to distribution, where a system that once operated as a whole starts to break into parts that must now function independently. And this is where preservation changes, because when coherence is lost, knowledge can no longer be held within a single structure. It has to be embedded, distributed across different systems, encoded into symbols, carried through myth, maintained in fragments that can survive even when the original form cannot. This is why the legacy of Atlantis does not appear as a continuation of the same system. It appears as variation, different traditions, different symbols, different interpretations of what was once aligned, each one holding a part of the structure, but not the whole. And this is where the next stage begins, because once knowledge is fragmented, it requires a different method of preservation. It can no longer rely on direct transmission. It must be encoded, embedded into systems that can carry it across time without needing to remain intact. This is where the fall of Atlantis becomes significant, not as an ending, but as a transformation, a shift from unity to multiplicity, from coherence to distribution, from direct structure to symbolic preservation. And this shift is what allows the system to continue, not in its original form, but in a way that can survive, because what cannot remain whole can still be remembered, not as a complete structure, but as a pattern that continues to appear, even in fragments. And once those fragments begin to be recognized, they can be traced, connected, reassembled, not to recreate what was lost, but to understand how it functioned. Because the fall of Atlantis is not separate from its structure, it is the next stage of it. And that is where we move next.